We're out of beer. Go get some now. It was a cold, snowy night outside that window that day. Exhausted from unceasing housework and childcare even after childbirth, I fell ill with a high fever. This was the response from my husband Steve, seeing me in such a state. Our daughter was also in a serious condition with a high fever. I lost all patience with Steve, who always put his needs first. What I did next. My name is Rachel. I'm a 31-year-old housewife. Steve, my husband, is 33 this year. He was a senior at our workplace. He used to be our mentor when we were newbies. We got married 2 years ago. After our marriage, I quit my job to become a full-time housewife. I got the job through connections, but I really enjoyed the work. I always like to work, I think. There was a part of me that wanted to keep working, but Steve insisted I focus on housework, so I reluctantly resigned. Now with a child born, I'm immersed in the world of first-time parenting. Steve was very kind and reliable before we got married, a popular senior among the newcomers at work. I, like everyone else, had always admired the kind Steve. He was surrounded by women, and I was overjoyed when he chose me. The problem started after marriage. In hindsight, I think there were signs even when we were dating. When we started dating, I began doing the cleaning at Steve's apartment. Not just cleaning, but laundry and meals too. I did all the housework. Our dates, which used to involve going out, became mostly at Steve's apartment. While I did the housework, Steve would play games or fiddle with his phone, doing whatever he pleased. Back then, I was thrilled, thinking Steve was showing his true self to me. I used to be happy thinking that this is what married life was like. I was so naive. I wish I had realized it back then. Regretting it after marriage is too late. Steve's attitude only worsened after marriage. He had a good public image, known in the neighborhood as a good husband. But inside the house, he was a tyrant who did nothing. No matter how busy I was with housework, he would demand things from me without a care. Even when I was pregnant with our daughter, his attitude didn't change. Being my first pregnancy, I was perhaps a bit too anxious. Morning sickness was severe from the early stages, and I couldn't eat properly for a long time. Making meals for Steve during that period was a torment. I'm sorry, Steve, but the morning sickness is bad today, and it's tough to cook. Could you have dinner at your mother's tonight? I'll call and explain. On a day when the morning sickness was so severe I could barely stand, I made this request to Steve. Steve's family home is about a 15-minute walk from our condominium. His parents are both healthy. Come over any time, they said. I get along with his mother, Laura. If I explain the situation to Laura, I'm sure she'll help. But Steve rejected my suggestion. What are you trying to get out of? Housework is your job, right? Pregnancy isn't an illness, so suck it up. Don't bother, Mom. Scolded over the phone, I just sat down defeated. He was right in a way. Housework is my responsibility. But I had wanted to work outside too. It was Steve who insisted I focus on housework at home, but his words now seemed too harsh. I was too sad to move from that spot for a while. This happened repeatedly during my pregnancy. Steve would always yell at me, saying pregnancy is not an illness. He even started assigning me tasks I usually wouldn't do, like cleaning windows or taking books to the secondhand bookstore. He didn't care about my physical condition. It seemed he just couldn't stand seeing me rest. I endured through the pregnancy, planning to return to my parents' home for childbirth. I had made up my mind about it. Around the 32nd week of pregnancy, I brought up the idea of going back home to give birth. I'm thinking of going back to my parents soon. It's my first baby and I want to give birth there. I broached the subject while serving coffee after dinner. Steve responded with dissatisfaction and glared at me. What nonsense are you talking about? Who will take care of me if you go home? Are you abandoning your duties as a wife? That's like refusing a work order. Follow the rules properly. I was speechless, stunned by his words. I couldn't believe how self-centered he was. Steve continued his monologue about what a wife and housewife should be, ultimately focusing on who would take care of him. I'm about to have my first baby. Going home means just the next town, not far at all. And even if I'm not here, Laura will take care of you. I knew if I backed out now, everything would go Steve's way, so I managed to speak up. So don't rely on Mom. You really lack awareness as a wife. I'm disappointed in our marriage. Stress during pregnancy is a big no-no. It's not good for prenatal education to be this upset. Staying with Steve would definitely be bad for the baby. I felt a pressing need to put some distance between myself and Steve, for the sake of our unborn child. Wait a minute, disappointed in our marriage? What? Is it so bad to go back to my parents' home to give birth? As I asked this, Steve clicked his tongue softly and returned to his room from the dining room, ignoring my voice, as if he couldn't hear anything inconvenient to him. I decided to give up the idea of returning to my parents' home for childbirth. I wanted to avoid creating more waves at home. That was my sole focus, I think. Despite the hardships during pregnancy, all those troubles seemed to vanish the moment I held my newborn daughter. It was a girl! Steve had only thought of boys' names, so it was up to me to name her. I decided to name her Maria. Steve mocked it as odd, but I was determined to give her this name if it was a girl. Thanks to Laura's support, there was no overturning the name I had chosen. With Maria's birth, we became a family of 3. I hoped that Steve's attitude would change a bit with the arrival of our child. Maybe becoming a father would remind him of his capacity for empathy. That's what I was hoping for. Unfortunately, Steve didn't change. He couldn't stand not being the center of attention, whether we had a child or not. Even when I was taking care of Maria, he would call me for trivial things. Not urgent matters, but minor ones like missing towels or socks. Yet, he still played the perfect, caring husband in front of my parents. My parents seemed to think of him as a thoughtful husband. However, my mother knew I had been discouraged from giving birth at my parents' home, so she might have had her suspicions. Enduring Steve's behavior every day was tough, but watching Maria grow made me forget those troubles. Then, 2 months after Maria's birth, an incident occurred. A severe cold wave had been sitting over us for several days, bringing continuous cold and snow. I was still recovering from childbirth, and this sudden cold worsened my condition. I felt dizzy all morning and had a temperature over 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. I thought I'd rest a bit when Maria took her nap. I tried desperately to put her to sleep, but usually easygoing Maria was fussy and wouldn't sleep, crying as if in pain. Panicking, I felt her forehead shocked by its heat. Her temperature was as high as mine. As I was preparing to take her to the hospital, Steve came home. I remember how he smirked, seeing me in a flurry. "Maria's running a fever. I'm taking her to the hospital." Steve just looked down at Maria lying red-faced in her crib, doing nothing. "Is my bath ready? What about my dinner?" I couldn't believe my ears. His own daughter was suffering from a high fever, and he was concerned about his bath and dinner. He went straight to the kitchen, still in his suit, peering into the fridge. Ignoring Steve, I continued preparing to take Mia to the hospital. Snow began to fall heavily outside. "Hey, there's no beer. Didn't you buy any?" Steve started yelling from the kitchen. I hadn't been able to go out due to feeling unwell, so I hadn't shot that day. I had also completely forgotten that we were out of beer. Steve gets incredibly grumpy without his beer. It seemed like bad things always come at once. "I'm sorry, it's snowing heavily and I'm not feeling well, so I didn't go shopping today." I explained this to Steve, who was standing grumpily in front of the fridge. "There's no beer. Go get some now." Steve's response indicated he hadn't absorbed a word I said. Pointing to the door, he demanded that I go to the nearby convenience store to buy beer, despite the heavy snow. Both Maria and I had high fevers. Despite such circumstances, he kept laughing. "Hurry up, isn't that a wife's job?" he continued. Seeing Steve's face, something inside me broke. Without a word, I turned my back on Steve to prepare to leave. "I'm going to take a bath first, so make sure you bring back the beer by the time I'm out. If you have a fever, the snow will cool you down." Steve hurled these cruel words at my back as I gathered my things. I'd reached my limit. I wouldn't tolerate this anymore. Irritated by my silence, Steve clicked his tongue and headed to the bathroom. Once I heard the bathroom door close, I quickly put my plan into action. While Steve was in the bath, I left the house with Maria. Steve probably heard the door close from the bathroom and thought I'd gone out to buy beer in the snow. I could hear his triumphant laughter from the bathroom. Unable to forget that laughter, I sneakily adjusted the water heater panel to make the bath water lukewarm. It was a small act of revenge. 2 hours later, my phone rang with a call from Steve. Taking a deep breath, I answered the call. "Hello?" As I spoke, Steve's yelling voice came through the phone. He seemed to be waiting for his beer after getting out of the bath. "Still not back? You're useless." Steve's demeaning tone was unbearable. I couldn't forgive a man who would send his feverish wife out in heavy snow to buy beer, especially while ignoring our daughter suffering from a high fever. "It's unbelievable." "I've just arrived at my parents' house," I informed him with as calm a voice as I could muster. Steve paused in shock. "Your parents' house?" When he asked, "Yes, my parents' house," I confirmed. I had left our home while Steve was in the bath. My destination was the pediatric emergency department. Feeling apprehensive alone, I stopped at my husband's parents' house on the way, and they drove me to the hospital. Fortunately, Maria's fever had decreased a bit by the time we arrived, and her condition was stable. However, she had to be hospitalized overnight for observation. Since the hospital didn't allow overnight companions, I left after confirming Maria was asleep. My in-laws offered to drive me home, but I candidly expressed my unwillingness to return. Initially suggesting their home, I insisted on going to my parents as quickly as possible and explained everything to my in-laws. They agreed to drive me to my parents, and that's when Steve's call came through as the car arrived. "I've gone back to my parents' house. Maria is hospitalized." "You left your husband and went back to your parents without even buying beer? How selfish can a wife be? What would Mom say? You'd be justified being called a failure as a wife." Steve's shouting voice leaking from the phone was heard by my in-laws in the car. Laura frowned and held her head. Steve probably had no idea that someone other than me was listening to his tirade. Unable to bear Steve's harsh words anymore, it was Laura who intervened. "Steve, do you even understand the situation?" She snatched the phone from me and spoke to Steve. He must have been shocked, never expecting his mother to hear him berating his wife. Steve, who had been so loud, fell silent. "Oh, what happened to your earlier bluster? How cruel can you be, making your feverish wife go out in the heavy snow to buy beer? Be ashamed of yourself." Laura scolded Steve fiercely over the phone. "I'll hear the full story from you, so don't go to bed." With that, Laura ended the call. I was stunned by her usually gentle demeanor. Steve always seemed a bit fearful of Laura. Perhaps she was the most intimidating when angry. My in-laws seemed to have understood everything from the conversation they overheard. Laura grasped my hands. "I'm so sorry," and she apologized to me many times. "Laura, you've done nothing wrong." She smiled apologetically at my words, her hands warmly enveloping mine. "I wanted to invite you for coffee, but now I'm going to give Steve a lesson," said my parents-in-law heading back home. My parents were a bit surprised to see me return home so suddenly, but accepted me without question. I remember taking off my shoes at the entrance, and then nothing else. Seeing my mother's face must have relaxed me. The tension I'd been holding snapped. The next morning, I woke up to an unfamiliar ceiling. I had collapsed in my parents' entrance and was taken to the hospital. My mother was reading a book beside my bed, noticing I was awake. "You're okay now," she called a nurse. I had become vulnerable to infection due to exhaustion and stress. I hadn't had a chance to rest properly since before giving birth. I was physically and mentally at my limit. I was nearly diagnosed with pneumonia and couldn't be discharged immediately. Laura was apparently looking after Maria at the hospital. I followed my mother's advice and got a detailed medical report. By noon, my father and a lawyer appeared in my room, inquiring about last night's events. My mother told me that my father was incredibly angry with Steve because of what had happened. My father, usually quiet and kind, becomes relentless when angered. Unfortunately, Steve had no escape this time. When I was hospitalized, my in-laws came to our house to apologize, but Steve wasn't with them. According to Laura, Steve insisted he wasn't wrong. Even his own parents were dismayed by his attitude. After a week in the hospital, I was finally discharged and rushed to Maria. Her release was still some time away. She remained in the incubator. Seeing her there, I decided to divorce Steve. That evening, I waited at home for Steve to return from work. "You're finally back. Aren't you ashamed as a wife, leaving your husband for a week? Plus, you got sick and hospitalized? You're the lowest of the low as a working adult for not managing your own health." Steve ranted the moment he saw me. I pressed the record button on my phone. It was snowing heavily that night. "What did you ask me to buy?" I asked. What? Beer, of course. There wasn't a single bottle in the fridge. It's a wife's duty to go buy it, no matter if it's a blizzard or whatever. Steve banged the table with both hands, trying to intimidate me. Did he think I would be scared by his loud voice and actions? Despicable. Why did I ever marry this man? If I could go back in time, I'd warn my past self not to do it. I told you I was feeling sick, didn't I? Maria had a high fever. Yet, what was your attitude? She's just a baby. How can you prioritize yourself? Unbelievable. Usually, I would have endured Steve's verbal abuse silently, but this time my defiance surprised him. He seemed to think that if he yelled and made a scene, I would cower and comply. It was like dealing with a tantruming child. But I had a duty to protect myself and Maria. I wouldn't be intimidated anymore. So self-righteous, aren't you? I'm the head of this household, the most important one. It's only natural for you to prioritize me. Steve bellowed, his face distorted in rage. I realized then that there wasn't a shred of love left for Steve and me. I presented him with divorce papers, already filled out. Let's get divorced. I can't live with you anymore. Steve's face turned red with rage upon seeing the divorce papers. He grabbed them and tore them up before me, smugly looking at me as if to say, "What now?" Calmly, I handed him another set of divorce papers. "Rachel, you..." As he tore them up, I kept presenting more, having anticipated his reaction. I had prepared as many filled out divorce papers as possible, knowing Steve would likely tear them up. "Please sign the divorce papers." I pushed a pen towards Steve, who glared at me but signed the divorce application. After ensuring everything was correctly filled out, I neatly folded the papers and put them in my bag. I asked Steve to communicate through our lawyer in the future, handing him the lawyer's business card. "I will take custody of Maria," I declared before leaving the home where we spent our married life. Ignoring the final barrage of insults Steve hurled at me, I felt a sense of liberation stepping out the door. I stopped by my in-laws' house to inform them of the divorce and express my gratitude. "I'm so sorry," Laura repeatedly apologized. I had one last request for them concerning Maria's custody. For my in-laws, Maria is their first grandchild. They probably wanted to keep her with them. Even if Steve couldn't raise her, they might have wanted to do it themselves. As I made my request, Laura gently patted my shoulder. "I can't bear to separate a mother and child," she said, smiling kindly at me. I was so moved by her gesture that I broke down in tears, and she comforted me until I calmed down. After submitting the divorce application, I officially divorced Steve. The custody battle for Maria became a bit contentious. Steve, seemingly out of spite, contested the custody and refused to pay the compensation and child support I requested. He blatantly declared in mediation that all issues arose due to my inadequacies as a wife. I submitted the recording of our last conversation and the medical report for my hospitalization due to high fever as evidence of the mental anguish Steve caused me. This evidence helped settle everything in my favor. Steve probably thought it was over, but my father had other plans. Steve's company was owned by my uncle, where I had been hired through a family connection. After my father explained everything to my uncle, who had always been fond of me, he was furious about how Steve treated his niece. As a result, Steve was demoted to a warehouse position, a severe blow to his career aspirations. He soon resigned, leaving with depleted savings after paying the compensation. His child support payments were consistently late, and his job hunt was unsuccessful. Local rumors said he was often drunk at a cheap bar, bad-mouthing me. When I first joined the company as a newcomer, everyone liked him. He was a wonderful person. But his downfall came all too quickly. When I last saw Steve, he looked like a different person. Dirty clothes, a grimy face, and his eyes lacked any spark of life, as if everything had ended for him. He eventually disappeared from the town, and I don't know what became of him. I returned to my parents' home with Maria. Realizing it would be challenging to raise her alone, I decided to seek support. I reflected on my past self who couldn't rely on others. My parents dote on Maria, and I can work during the day with peace of mind. My new job is challenging with lots to learn, but I'm happier than ever compared to my restricted life before. I'm looking forward to Maria's growth and living a fulfilling life with her.